is terribly betrayed. It's just a parallels. It happened with David, it happened with him. That's all. Think of how striking it would be if, just as it happened with Abraham Lincoln and the freeing of the slaves, and then he was assassinated. Let's say hundreds of years later in American history, a great American president rises up who brings complete transformation of the nation, and he too is killed. What a striking parallel. You just call it a striking parallel. But when the Bible is filled with these striking parallels, again, as I said earlier, it's the whole of Scripture pointing towards him. So the Messiah, the ideal representative of his people, and as I said, he fulfills Israel's destiny. Certain passages, if someone says, is that Israel, is it the Messiah? I say yes. Yeah, because it's about Israel and it's fulfilled through the Messiah, the ideal representative of his people. And then the eighth, and you've got some substantial notes there, so I want you to look on with me. The prophecies of the glorious return from the Babylonian exile serve as the template for interpreting messianic prophecy. The prophecies of the glorious return from the Babylonian exile serve as the template for interpreting messianic prophecy. What does that mean? I had the joy and privilege of working on a commentary on the book of Jeremiah for the new edition of the Expositor's Bible commentary series. Probably wrote about 650 pages. The battle was to keep it to that. It was supposed to be 450 pages, but they were pleased with the material and let me go a little further with it. I finished it around January of 2005, and it's just waiting its slot in the series to be published. But there are a lot of passages that I came to thinking I've got some questions about how this works itself out. And I'll give you an example. Let's go to Jeremiah 23. Jeremiah 23. God rebukes the shepherds who were the kings and the leaders of his day, Jeremiah's day, who were destroying and scattering the sheep of his pasture. And God's going to bring judgment on them. Verse 3 of Jeremiah 23, I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I've driven them, will bring them back to their pasture, where they'll be fruitful and increase in number. Verse 5, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch. There's branch again. Semach, same one as we find later on in Zechariah, that Semach, the branch, typified by Yehoshua, the high priest. I'll raise up to David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he'll be called, the Lord our righteousness, or the Lord is our righteousness. Even debate over those words and how they should be translated. But this is the simple point. It seems that God was saying, okay, I'm going to judge the godless shepherds. I'm going to regather my people. And then David's going to be raised up among them. Okay, so the Jews come back from Babylonian exile, say it's roughly the 530s BCE. Now you expect they get regathered. There are other prophecies that seem to speak of glorious restoration, rebuilding the temple, messianic age, but it didn't happen. I mean, lots of prophecies in Jeremiah. Here's a summary. This is a summary of Jeremiah's expectations by the critical Old Testament scholar, in other words, liberal critical scholar, S.R. Driver. He was a brilliant biblical and Hebrew scholar. So this is what he writes here. You have it in your notes. Not only does he, Jeremiah, promise what actually came to pass, the return of the exiles to the territories of Benjamin and Judah, and the resumption there of the interrupted social life, in which again, as of old, the sounds of joy and life would be heard in the villages. I'm going to skip all the scripture references, but you have them there in your notes. So he said, Jeremiah prophesied these things, and this actually did happen. Shepherds would again tend their flocks, houses and fields would again be bought and sold by the restored exiles. But he invests the future with ideal colors. The exiles of the northern kingdom will share in the restoration. The hills of Ephraim will again resound with happy throngs and be clad with cornfields and vineyards. A great company will return from the furthest corners of the earth. The wants of all will be abundantly satisfied. The national life will be reestablished. Jerusalem will be rebuilt and will be entirely holy to Yahweh. The restored nation is pictured as returning to Yahweh with its whole heart. Words of confession and penitence are put into the mouth of both Judah and Ephraim. The iniquity of Israel will be forgiven and remembered no more. One heart and one way, even the way of Yahweh's fear, will be given to them. Israel will be Yahweh's people and will be their God. More than this, a new and spiritual covenant will be established with the house of Israel, and the nation will be ruled not by a system of observances imposed from without, but by a law written in the heart, filling all with the knowledge of Yahweh and prompting all to ready and perfect obedience. There will be no ark, nor will the ark be either needed or missed. The people will be governed by upright, disinterested shepherds, that is, judges and princes, after God's own heart, and a perfect king of David's line, supreme over all, will maintain judgment and righteousness in the land and ensure peace for its inhabitants. The ruler of the future will be of native birth and enjoy the priestly privilege of access to Yahweh. Israel has but to turn loyally to Yahweh for the nations to be moved by the spectacle of its blessedness, to own him as their God. Elsewhere in the books, the nations are depicted as in the future discarding their idols, confessing that Yahweh alone is God, and looking with awe and wonder at the restored Zion. Israel will never be cast off by Yahweh or cease from being a nation before him. Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Elam, after their expected desolation by Nebuchadnezzar, will be restored. Now, Jeremiah says all this is going to happen. And that quote meant a lot to me because I had to type the whole thing out to put it in my commentary. There's a lot of material there. But he summed it up so wonderfully. But here's the deal. Jeremiah, in the 25th and the 29th chapter of his book, spoke of 70 years of exile. And after 70 years, God would restore the Jewish people to the land. And all this would happen. But it didn't. Well, it did in part, but not completely. It did, but not in the expected measure. Now, I'm not focusing on the Messiah here. All these prophecies. The temple was rebuilt, but not with the expected glory. The exiles did return, but God's going to make a way in the wilderness, and the whole earth's going to see the glory of God as the exiles return. Instead, it's this kind of a band of ultimately about 44,000 over a few years making their way back into the land and the temple. This is the new temple. Yikes. It's not what we remembered. And where is the whole nation's going to follow him with one heart? And did it happen? No, but, well, in part. Not according to the expected measure. So for Driver, who was a critical scholar, not necessarily seeing these words as inspired the same way as we would, he felt that the prophets were idealists. God's going to do all this, whoa, and it's going to be bigger and better. Whoa, and exiles are going to return. They just start to dream, and they picture this whole thing, and, well, it didn't really happen, but they were idealists. Well, if we accept the scriptures being inspired and Jeremiah as being a true prophet, we can't simply say that. So, what's the explanation? Take a look at what I've written here. Do you understand the significance of this? Jeremiah, much like Ezekiel, expected that the return of the exiles from Babylon would be so glorious that it would be followed by the transformation of the nation through the inauguration of the new covenant in the reign of the Messiah, leading ultimately to the transformation of the whole world. Were Jeremiah and Ezekiel false prophets? God forbid. Rather, what they prophesied did happen, only not in the expected measure or scope. Remember, the principle is the prophecies of the glorious return from the Babylonian exile serve as the template for interpreting messianic prophecy.